Hi and welcome to this video. By now we've explored a number of different elements of research, everything from paradigms through to data collection. So in this video we're going to explore qualitative data analysis. We're going to look at what it involves, some of the main approaches and some of the challenges involved. So what is qualitative analysis? Well, it seeks to understand a phenomenon from the participant's perspective. As we've understood elsewhere and we've discussed, it's about making sense of our lived experiences. So having planned our methodology and our methods, and having collected some data, the analysis of it is the next critical stage in the process. It's where we begin to make sense of the data we've collected. Qualitative data analysis embraces interpretation and exploration of multiple meanings. This is crucial. We're not looking for a single truth or trying to reduce everything down to statistics. Rather, we're trying to understand the richness and complexity of human experience. This means that we're accepting that there may be multiple valid interpretations of the same data. It's not a weakness that happens, it's a strength of the qualitative research process. So, qualitative analysis is not simply about organising data, even though the organisation of the data is part of a process. Instead, the real goal is to make sense of the data. However, it's important to understand that the meaning we're attempting to arrive at is the meaning that the participants themselves have of a situation. This is fundamental. We're trying to understand how the participants see themselves and their experience in the world. The process of analysis is a deep and holistic process, organising, describing and accounting for data. All these activities are in the service of understanding meaning, not simply creating neat categories of understanding. So, previously, just now, we've discussed that the whole point of this is to start to see the world through the eyes of the participants. However, as we've raised elsewhere, there's an argument about whether this is actually possible. As a researcher, you bring your own biography, values, assumptions, and experiences. These actively shape the analysis. Everything you bring to the research, even your bias, all influence how you interpret data. So in quantitative research, this is a significant problem. But in qualitative research, we acknowledge this subjectivity and we see it as a strength. We're not pretending to be a neutral observer. Instead, we're being transparent about our role in the research process. This is why reflexivity, the acknowledgement of our positionality in the research, is so important. You need to be aware of how you're shaping the analysis, and you need to make that visible for your readers. A key aspect of data analysis is the recognition of patterns and themes. These patterns and themes are actively constructed by the researcher through careful analytic work. Typically, this is an inductive process where the researcher builds from specific data points towards more abstract categories and themes. You begin with the concrete of what people actually said or did, and gradually to build towards broader conceptual understanding. It's the opposite of a deductive research approach where you begin with a theory and test it. In qualitative research, you typically begin building up and developing the theory as you explore the data. It's important to recognize that analysis is not a final, separate stage that occurs having collected all of your data. Instead, it's part of an ongoing and iterative process that occurs simultaneously with data collection. You collect some data, you analyse it, then you use that initial analysis to inform the next wave of data collection. For instance, you might realise you need to ask different questions or interview different people or even observe different situations as you go through the data collection process. So this allows the inquiry to be flexible, as emerging themes can be explored and placed into subsequent interviews or observations. You're not locked into a rigid data collection plan. You can adapt as you learn. So this is one of the great advantages of qualitative research, but it also means you need to be highly organised and thoughtful throughout the entire research process. not just at the end. So as we've discussed, there are a number of key elements involved in the process. Firstly, inductive logic. We're building from the ground up. Typically, you'll not be starting with a hypothesis. Instead, you're building understanding from what you observe and record. Next, it's an emergent approach. The process is flexible and adaptable. Methods may be modified as new insights are gained, and your research design can evolve as you learn more. Finally, it involves thoughtful decision making. Given that it's an emergent process, whilst we want you to maintain a systematic approach generally, there's space here for change. This is why at several points I've described research in terms of it being akin to art or an artistic practice. There is a general set of rules and systems that you've got to be aware of and follow. However, truly exceptional research comes from thoughtful and creative application of these rules. They need to be applied in service to the broader goal of understanding reality and answering the primary question of your research. So, discussing your decisions with a supervisor or with your peers can be an important element in the overall process, and it's something that we support by offering regular tutorials or supervisions. However, I'd also encourage you to meet with your peers regularly and discuss your progress and the challenges and successes. That can be a really helpful process, helping everybody to understand what they're going through and how they're making sense of their data. So we previously discussed methodologies and methods and how they're used to underpin our research approach. However, it's important to note that the process of analysis must be directly tied back to your methodology and your methods. As we progress through this video, we're going to talk broadly about typical analysis approaches. But it's important to note that specific methods require specific forms of analysis. For instance, the way we might analyse an interview in a case study is very similar to the way we might analyse it for a narrative inquiry, but there are also some significant differences. The approach may look almost identical, but the intent is somewhat different. So, let's look at coding. Coding's kind of the most fundamental building block that underpins qualitative analysis. Coding is essentially segmenting your data and tagging it with labels that capture what's happening or being discussed. So it might be that if we're talking about motivation and practice, that you'll have a code for practice and you might have another code for motivation. So the idea here is to capture what's happening or being discussed. The codes can be predetermined based on your theoretical framework or your research question, or they can develop naturally as you work through your data. Coding is how you start to organise and make sense of what might be potentially hundreds of pages of data. It's the step that takes us from raw data to analysis. There are different types of coding and they happen at different places at points in your research. So the first type of coding is typically open coding. This is the earliest initial form that a researcher will undertake. It involves reading through your data line by line or paragraph by paragraph and asking what's happening here. You're being very open to whatever you find. However, you might at this point end up with dozens or even hundreds of codes. That's fine, you're not trying to be selective yet. Instead, what you're trying to do is to capture the richness of your data. Very often the next stage might be analytical coding. This is a specific form of coding. Here we're moving from description, what's happening, to interpretation, to what it means. It's an approach that draws together and gives more explanatory and analytical meaning to a group of descriptive codes. It might mean bringing together several separate codes, or potentially it might be part of the initial opening coding phase. Axial coding, this is really when we're starting to bring things together. So it refers to the creation of category labels under which separate open codes are likely to be placed. It groups together identifying things as being automatically linked. So if you have several codes that relate to the same underlying idea, you group them together using an axial code. You're creating a structure or axis, hence the description of axial coding. This is part of the process of reducing and organizing your data. You're taking all of the initial codes and beginning to see how they relate to each other, which ones go together, which ones are about the same things. Selective coding is where you identify the core category in your data. So you're essentially saying, what's the study really about? What's the main story here? What's the thing that's predominant, that's most important, and what are the things that are sitting around the edge of it? So with selective coding, you create a category that becomes the organizing principle for your analysis. Everything else relates to it in some way. This is often one of the most challenging, but also one of the most exciting parts of analysis. It's when you realize what your data is actually telling you. Finally, we have theoretical coding. This normally happens towards the end of the analysis process. It's where we start to see how codes and categories are integrated and fit together to create a theory or a hypothesis. This is kind of the highest level abstraction. It's not just organizing data or identifying themes, rather it's about building an explanatory framework. It's about showing how different elements relate to each other, what causes what, and how a process unfolds. This is particularly associated with grounded theory methodology, where the goal is to develop a theory that's grounded in the data. The elements of the theoretical coding are useful in other methodological approaches too, whenever you're trying to explain a relationship or process that you've observed. So those are some of the main ways we can think about coding, but it's also useful to be aware of some of the challenges of coding because it's not without issues. So depending upon the size of your project, you're likely to gather a large quantity of data. Coding this data can be a massive undertaking. At the same time, you must ensure reliability and validity. So how do you know that your codes are accurate? You've got to start to develop a large number of codes, but central to the process of research is answering a question. And what happens if none of the codes that you're developing actually help you address the question? In that case, the process, whilst interesting, perhaps might be flawed. You've got to consider if you're following a systematic process. And would another researcher potentially code things in the same way that you are? We've got to acknowledge that as a researcher, we're subjective. We're in an interpretivist paradigm. However, we also need to ensure that we're being somewhat systematic. We're not simply being open to bias. So balancing these two things is really critical. There's a potential, if we're simply looking at very small, discrete packages of code, that we lose the meaning of them. So extracting a single sentence from a paragraph can be problematic. But equally, we're trying to thin down our data into these single sentences. So there's a challenge there, particularly if we're dealing with large numbers of interviews, in being sure that we're getting the exact meaning. Finally, we've got to recognize that coding is not a static process. So the way you code your initial forms of data might need to be revisited after you've collected further data. So this can lead to a rather convoluted process involving many iterative stages, where you're coding and then recoding. You need to be aware of this before you begin and ensure that time set aside for you allow the process to start to happen organically, where you go round and round these iterative cycles. So, coding should be viewed as the tool we will use to analyse. But when we use this tool, we might be searching for slightly different things. So for that reason, there are a number of different types of analysis that fit kind of underneath it. Each form of analysis has a slightly different emphasis and is suited to different kinds of research questions, or potentially also different forms of methodology. So we're briefly going to look at 4 common types of analysis, but it's important to note that these are kind of the most frequently used. They're not all encompassing. And they're also going to be kind of a brief look at each one, and it's important that you go and look at them in more detail if you're thinking of using one of these approaches. Probably the most commonly used approach is thematic analysis. In essence, it's kind of what we were describing when we just blankly talk about coding. It's a method of identifying and analysing and reporting patterns and themes within data. In a way, because it's so open, its flexibility is its strength. You're not tied to a particular theoretical framework, so it can be used with many different types of data. It's the most frequently used form of analysis amongst master's students. So interestingly, whilst it's still widely referred to in most of the core texts, an interesting thing is that virtually none of them provide a clear definition of exactly what it is. So the paper which is referred to and cited in this slide is probably one of the core texts that you might want to look at if you're thinking of doing thematic analysis. It's a good place to start if you're interested in this approach, not least because it compares and contrasts it with other analysis types. Content analysis is different. It might sound like it begins in a similar place. However, having done the initial coding, the researcher then counts and logs the number of times specific words or codes appear. So in this way, it's an approach that kind of turns qualitative data into quantitative data. It allows you to start to see patterns occur over large data sets, and it can add weight to your analysis by highlighting not only what's said or observed, but also by highlighting the relative importance of each of the different kind of codes and findings that you have. So it's important not to lose sight of the richness of the qualitative data and simply just focus on counting how often things happen. But if we use it judiciously, it can be a powerful tool to help you better understand the data you've collected. Discourse analysis takes us in a very different direction again. Here the analysis investigates language and meaning. It examines the use of language, its linguistic features and forms. It explores the language patterns and units and how meanings are constructed through texts beyond a single sentence. So here we're not just looking at what people said, we're exploring how they said it, what linguistic strategies they used, how they described their accounts, the assumptions that underlie their language. This is particularly useful when you're interested in power and how social realities are constructed through language or in the fine details of interactions. The next form of analysis that we'll explore is narrative analysis, and it's strongly interpreted based on the author's construction rather than objective truth. It's a way of reporting personal experience or observations to enable fresh insights on often familiar situations. Narrative analysis focuses on the stories themselves. It treats the stories not just as information about events, but in terms of them themselves being meaningful constructions that reveal how people make sense of their experience. You might look at the narrative structures or how stories are organised, the kind of plots they follow. You might look at the content, the kind of characters that appear and the themes that emerge. You might look at function. What work is the story doing for the teller? Narrative analysis is particularly powerful when you're interested in identity and how people understand their life trajectories and how people make sense of difficult or transformative experiences. As you can probably imagine, this form of analysis is particularly useful within narrative inquiry methodology. So, having decided upon the coding approach and the analysis method, we might best conceive of the overall process of being kind of akin to a spiral, and this is how Creswell describes it. So it begins with organising the data, transcribing, sorting and managing files, and this is kind of like the practical foundational work. Next, we're reading the text, writing memos as we immerse ourselves within the data. We're going to be jotting down reflective thoughts, and this is really where we begin to engage deeply and immerse ourselves with that data. Next, we begin describing, classifying and interpreting the data. So this is where we're going to be coding and really starting to get into the analysis. Next, we're probably going to be representing that in visual forms of one type or another. Perhaps that's developing narratives. It could be creating tables and matrices so that we can start to think about what our data looks like. But, and this is important, we've not been describing, or perhaps we have just now been describing, a linear process. But as Cresswell describes it, he sees this not as linear, but instead as something that's more iterative. So the point here is that frequently, whilst we might move through this process sequentially, very often we're going to double back and move to a different stage. So perhaps having started with our single source of data, the first thing we've collected, we move through these stages, and then as we collect further data, we double back on ourselves. Perhaps we go back and we reorganize the data, or we reread our memos that we've created for the first piece of data we analyzed, and we then reinterpret it based upon the second piece of data. So we know the basic process, we know about coding, we know about how we might analyze the data in different ways. But all of this has to come around ensuring that we've got rigor and validity. Just because qualitative research embraces subjectivity and interpretation, it doesn't mean that kind of anything goes and we can make stuff up. The entire time we're balancing complex decision making and making sure that kind of a balance is struck between a free process where we're able to flex and move as different data appears, and being systematic so that we can claim this to be research. A key part of the rigor of the validity comes from triangulation. So this is when we start to bring together multiple data sources. For example, we might have interviews and observations, or we might make multiple interviews. If all the different data sources point or align on a particular conclusion, then it strengthens any claim we might make based upon that. So the idea here is not necessarily to have 3, but to have multiple sources. That could be 2, or that could be 10. Another approach that we've previously discussed is called member checking. So having undertaken an interview, let's say, and analysed it, we then return to the participant and we describe how we've analysed it. And then we ask them whether they recognise themselves in the analysis. Does it ring true? So this is the process of member checking. Finally, it's important to maintain a clear audit trail. So this means that you're keeping detailed records of your entire research process, from data collection through to final analysis. And this allows others to follow your decision making. So in theory, someone should be able to look at your audit trail and understand exactly how you got from your raw data to your conclusions. So although we're not seeking generalizable truth in a positivist sense, if we follow these broad approaches, hopefully we're going to increase the likelihood that our interpretations are trustworthy and credible, and that they're grounded in systematic analysis rather than simply our biases or our hunches. So as I said, this video really is an overview, and it should be considered a starting point. The texts in this bibliography are the core ones that you're going to want to refer to. So having decided upon the approach that you're going to take, I would suggest that what you do is you look up the particular coding approach or the analysis approach, and you look at it a lot more deeply to find out exactly how you might apply it to your research question and your research overall. Anyway, I hope it's been useful, and I hope it's given you some starting points, and I'll see you in the next one of these videos.